Thank you. So now I'm introducing the next speaker, Markus LINDNER from the European Forest Institute. He's going to talk about innovative forest genetic resources management to cope with climate change.
Thank you, Barbara. So I'm now going to talk about forest genetic resource management and adaptation to climate change and put that into context with management in Europe to inform policies. I will quickly run through climate change, but not about projections, but rather some observations, look at adaptation needs, and then talk about management conditions across Europe, and then to end up in the forest genetic resource management. And I'm starting with this slide. We will all, I think, look back at 2018 and 2019 as the year when we changed from climate change scenarios to actually experiencing climate change. This graph shows the observed temperature record from the station in Potsdam in Germany. It's the average of the April to August temperatures. And you see that we always had extreme hot years also in the past, but they were about 2 degrees warmer than the first 30 years average. But in 2018, we had 4 degrees warmer than those reference period in the first 30 years of the observation record. So the extreme is very, very different compared to what we experienced before. And why is that? It's because of the weather change, with the system change in the weather patterns, which has really changed in the last years. And this is leading to more extreme events with longer lock-in of the weather constellation in one place that leads to the extended drought and heat waves we see. Since 1950, these are again observational records, Europe has seen a tripling of days with extreme heat, and these hot days have warmed by 2.3 degrees. So this study by Lorenz et al. Has also had a very worrying statement when they compared the observations with projections from climate models. They show that the climate models are systematically underestimating these extreme events. So our projections in impact assessments are based on climate models, but these climate models are over-optimistic. They're not really fully showing the forest affecting effects of extreme events and drought. 2018-19, we had a lot of global records, like records measured in many different places around the globe, hitting 46 degrees here in France. I find it quite unbelievable. But also in places like Netherlands, more than 40 degrees. That's really quite amazing. In Germany, we also had unprecedented drought. So not only the temperature, but also we have soil moisture measurements since 50 years. We never have experienced such depleted soil water measurements from the soil. It's because the combination of heat and lack of precipitation really led to exceptionally dry conditions. So what does this mean for adaptation? Forests will obviously need to adapt, and they will have to adapt to long-term changes in climate, to shifting seasonal water availability, to increase variability with more extreme weather, like the prolonged droughts, storms, and floods, but also to more frequent and severe disturbances. So do we know how to adapt, and do we have adaptation strategies in place? I'm involved in the Forest Europe expert group on climate change adaptation, and we did a survey to ask the countries, do you have adaptation strategies in place? And those countries who have responded, most of them do have now some adaptation strategies in place. Often these are cross-sectoral strategies. Maybe the revisions then made it more specific on also including more details on forest management. So most countries nowadays do have adaptation strategies. Some countries didn't respond to the survey, so there's a few countries missing here. So most countries have strategies in place. But what do they contain? Do we actually know what kind of measures we need to apply to adapt to climate change? So there is a lot of knowledge about possible adaptation strategies. For example, in this review that we did a few years ago by Maya Kolstrom et al. So we know a lot what could be adaptation measures, but we don't know always as well when and how to implement them. So we stressed the importance of disturbances before. We need to adapt to more extreme and more frequent disturbances, and we do actually have quite some experience how to prevent, with our management, how to prevent some of the disturbances. But while many of them should also be still valid under climate change, not all of them. I mean, there will be challenges, for example, with wildfire management. Climate change really is a system change here, and we can't apply what we thought would be working in the past will not necessarily work in the future. But I think we lack even more experience how to manage these species decline and the extreme drought and the consequences, and how to select suitable species in forest restoration. The region where I'm now living in Northern Westphalia, in the west of Germany, there's 40,000 hectares of spruce stands that have collapsed now after bark beetle, and the silviculturists don't know what to plant there because all the species that they thought would be rather tolerant have also been affected by drought recently. So in this context, we also asked experts in this expert group on adaptation to climate change, do you believe that the identified adaptation measures are appropriate and sufficient? This is a small qualitative survey, but less than 50% thought that the identified measures are appropriate and sufficient. So 1/3 clearly said no, what we have is not appropriate and not sufficient, which is quite worrying, I think. So let's move to the management context. We have to place all these things into what we actually have in terms of forest types and management traditions. And I believe that because of the much more rapid evolving of the climate change with the extreme events, we really have to apply a health check to our present management paradigms and also to the prospective adaptation measures. As we saw, experts don't believe that what we identified as adaptation measure will be sufficient. So we need to really query and investigate where are possible deficiencies. One approach here is in our national funded INFORMAR project, which is dealing with integrated forest management, how nature conservation and wood production can be integrated. In this project, we also looked at how the relationship between integrated forest management and climate change adaptation, how these things are compatible with each other, and whether the common measures which are advocated, whether they are actually suitable under the context of climate change and extreme events. And then we will also later on then use some of the results from the GenTree work, linking forest management with genetics and climate change adaptation. So in INFORMAR, we did a kind of a compatibility and suitability check. So we looked at the integrated forest management measures and compared them with the climate change adaptation measures from the literature, but also from our Forest Europe survey, where the experts were actually asked to specify what kind of adaptation measures are used in their countries. So we compare this and then look at whether these are compatible with each other. And then we also check whether these measures actually align with the currently ongoing ecological processes and the observed climate change. So 2 examples. Species diversification is a measure which is very commonly proposed from integrated forest management to support biodiversity. It's also a typical measure that is proposed for climate change adaptation to increase forest resilience. So these measures are really completely overlapping in the direction and the type of silvicultural operation that is proposed. That's good. But in other cases, like deadwood management, for example, while this is advocated from integrated forest management to support different types of diversity of fungi and saproxylic fauna, for example, it's in climate change adaptation, it's rather the opposite, that fresh deadwood from spruce should be removed to lower the risk of bark beetle attack and spread. So here we have a clear mismatch in direction of change and the proposed silviculture operations. So that's clear that there's a challenge here to integrate these different objectives of nature conservation and climate change adaptation. And then we also then take the next step that we, after we have compared these measures, we then always contrast them with the observations that we see now in terms of the ongoing climate change and what we understand as the ecological processes that are taking place. And then we find that popular integrated forest management and climate change adaptation measures such as use of close to nature silviculture, they are not sufficient to actually cope with what we are now seeing as the effects of extreme events in climate change. So obviously, we will need to design additional adaptation strategies in addition to what the national experts so far had been designing or proposing. So this brings me then to the forest genetic resources, because also GenTree, of course, tried to propose measures that help trees to better adapt to climate change, and we would like to integrate this in our management and policy recommendations. So what we did, we made an effort to link forest management practices with forest genetic resources. For that, we developed what we call a decision tree. So we are having management decisions which are then translated into silviculture operations. And for each of these, we are then looking at how does this management decision and the silviculture operation, how does this have an effect on the forest genetic resources? To do that, we have filled tables where we break down the impacts in terms of short-term and long-term benefits and risks. And we characterize then the impacts in terms of the effects on environment, in terms of biotic and abiotic environment, competition between species, mating system, reproductive success, and phenotypic selection. That's just an example to give the flavor of this. So in this case, soil cultivation does have various short-term and long-term effects, which will then affect the fitness of the new regeneration, and then has also, of course, consequences on forest genetic resource management. So by filling this for all the different management decisions, we get a better understanding of where are the decisions which can actually affect the suitability and the adaptiveness of the FGR management to future conditions. And we try to do this also with explicit consideration of these climate change adaptation needs. So then the next step is that we are linking this with our effort to actually map forest management across Europe. This was also a GenTree effort. We are going to release an atlas of forest management practices across Europe next month. Didn't make it for this conference, unfortunately. But this shows there's substantial differences in management between European regions and countries in terms of management paradigms and technology and so on. And strikingly, there's no good overview of these practices available at the moment. So this atlas will be a very nice new achievement to provide a very systematic overview across Europe in terms of forest management practices. And this is important because we need to understand the regional differences to determine conditions for forest genetic resource conservation and management, and also to understand how this management constrains climate change adaptation. I mentioned before already this one example of close to nature management. That really is a paradigm in many countries where people believe that close to nature management is the way to go, in contrast to plantation forestry, for example. But it clearly is reaching thresholds where if your so far native species are no longer coping with the future conditions of climate change, you have to do something to expand your genetic resources for those systems. So the Atlas will then give overview of forest management practices in general chapters on how management varies across Europe. And then we have country narratives for 27 European countries. 3 are still incomplete, but we are going to have them complete, I hope, next month. So then we also show how these management conditions affect and constrain FGR conservation management across Europe. Then we are making the effort to then link in the outputs of GenTree into this framework to give recommendations to forest management and policy. And these are just 2 examples from a workshop we have done in Thessaloniki, where we asked the different work packages, what is your contribution, how your work can actually help FGR conservation and management. And one statement here from work package 1 was that a gene conservation scheme can help identify important genes for breeding. It also allows that other forests are more intensively managed. Or from work package 3, refocus on juveniles in regeneration phase because adaptive capacity depends on whether a seedling juvenile is able to survive the first few years. So these are examples which we will connect with our overview of management practices and the decision tree to show in which elements we can actually make a change through conscious use of innovative practices we are proposing from GenTree. And then this will then all be summarized in recommendations for policy and practice. So we want to move beyond going this understanding how the impacts of policies management affect forest genetic resources towards proactively influencing of policy management to improve forest genetic resource conservation and management. And just a few examples, I'm not going to read all of these. These are just examples of recommendations which we will have in our final deliverable of the GenTree project, which are picking up some of the elements which come from the work in GenTree and which connect with the need to adapt management and also in part policy making to improve forest genetic resource conservation and management in the future. That's my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Question from the floor?
Thank you. Yeah, Hoika, Tiger. I was just very happy that at last 2 of the lecturers have mentioned also mycorrhiza. And thank you very much. I'm sure there will be plenty of questions about and discussion about your lecture later on. But in one of the tables you had the benefits from soil scarification of mycorrhiza. Can I ask which expert has written this statement? Thank you.
We have done a literature review, and part of these statements were coming from literature review. And then we asked, and I can't tell you off my head now which citation that was, but we also asked some of the colleagues who are more genetic experts than we are, including Francois and Mirko and others, to help us identify some of these linkages. Yeah, I can't tell you now exactly who was responsible for that. But I just picked out one of the tables. There will be lots of tables, and of course you can always question a certain aspect and then discuss whether this is the right interpretation or not. But I think what's important is that you have to raise the awareness that there are many more decisions than just selecting the species, which is going to affect your future FGR, because some of these soil cultivation things, for example, if you have natural regeneration, whether or not you use some soil preparation will affect how many additional species you will have in addition to your planted stock maybe. And then there might be then indirect effects that you're not expecting. But we can discuss this more also in the break later on.
I have a question about the translation of new innovative management approaches into policies. If you can elaborate a bit about that, and also if you can talk about the role of your own organization in facilitating this bridging between management and policy, if you are the right player to help this community to get forest genetic resources management better visible in management, or what is your thinking about this?
Well, I'm quite often in different contexts. I'm myself at this interface between science and practice, or science and policy, my personal background is more in climate change adaptation than genetics. So I'm not really so solid in this genetic research. But I think it's really important that this, what I try to highlight here, that we need to understand how management practices are different across Europe. I'm always really surprised when you talk with any researcher. They're mostly really knowing their systems, their region, and they take it for granted that you have a certain management paradigm. It could be that you're working with plantations and that you're just like really used that everything is planted, or you can be in a system where planting is completely unthinkable. So you have to really stress this message a lot, that you have to understand that conditions are so different. And I think an organization like EFI has, of course, connections with lots of stakeholders in different parts of Europe. So I think it's very important that we also raise awareness about the diversity of situations, and that policymakers understand that if you want to have a role of forestry in the Green Deal, you need to have measures to safeguard that actually our forests are going to be still productive also under climate change. And I think some of the results I try to show here are suggesting that we might have really big challenges, because the existing management paradigms really are not fit for what we are experiencing now in terms of climate change. I'm not sure if I was able to really answer your question.